foreign ship sailed into Edo Bay in 1853. Japan could not stop it, could not fight it, could only watch. The men who watched that day made a decision. Never again. What they built in the next 50 years was not just a country. It was an answer.
Hi, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. If this video caught your interest, subscribe to the channel. The real lives of the wealthy in the past were far stranger, more scandalous, and more fascinating than any TV series. If you agree, hit subscribe. If you think I'm exaggerating, drop a comment. The next story will shatter yet another myth about the glamorous life of the elite.
July 8th, 1853. 4 ships appear in Edo Bay. They are not sailing ships. They move without wind, black smoke pouring from their funnels, the water around them churning white. The Japanese had a name for them immediately: Kurofune, the black ships. No one on shore had seen anything like this. Samurai on the beach reached for their swords, then stopped. Because what could a sword do against this? The ships belonged to Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy. His mission was simple: open Japan. Japan had been closed to the outside world for over 200 years. No foreign ships, no foreign trade, no foreign ideas. The Tokugawa shogunate had built a wall around the entire country and called it peace. Perry didn't ask permission to enter. He sailed in, anchored in the bay, and waited. He brought gifts: a telegraph machine, 100 gallons of whiskey, and a train. Not a real train, a working scale model. A miniature steam locomotive with 100 meters of track laid out in a circle on the beach. Japanese officials watched it run. Some of them climbed on top and rode it around the circle, too large for the small cars, their legs dragging on the ground, laughing with what looked like delight but was probably something closer to fear, because they understood immediately what that toy meant. If Americans could build this small, what did the real version look like? What else did they have that Japan had never seen? Perry left. He said he would return in 1 year for Japan's answer. The shogunate spent that year in complete paralysis. They knew they could not fight. They had seen the guns on those ships. They knew they could not refuse. They had seen what happened to China when it refused Western demands. So they signed. The Convention of Kanagawa, 1854. Japan opened 2 ports to American ships. Then more treaties followed. More ports, more concessions, more humiliation. The wall that had protected Japan for 200 years came down in a single year. And the men who had built that wall, the shogunate, the samurai class, never recovered their authority. 14 years later, they were gone, replaced by something Japan had not seen in centuries: an emperor with real power, and a government with one single idea: never again. Never again would a foreign ship sail into a Japanese bay and make Japan feel small. The Emperor Meiji is 16 years old. He has never ruled anything. But the men around him have a plan so ambitious it borders on insane. They are going to rebuild Japan from the ground up, in 1 generation. Not gradually, not carefully. Fast, deliberately, completely. The new government looked at Japan and made a list of everything it lacked: railways, telegraphs, steel mills, a modern navy, a modern army, banks, universities, newspapers, a constitution, a postal system, lighthouses, sewers, hospitals. Then they went shopping. They hired foreigners, thousands of them. They called them Oyatoi Gaikokujin, hired foreign experts. At its peak, the Meiji government employed over 3,000 foreign specialists simultaneously: British engineers to build the railways, French advisors to restructure the army, German doctors to build the medical system, American educators to redesign the schools, Dutch engineers to build the harbors. They paid them extraordinary salaries. A British railway engineer in 1870 earned more working for Japan than he would have earned in England. Japan wanted the best, and it paid for the best. But here is what made the Meiji approach different from every other nation that hired foreign experts. They didn't just hire them to do the work. They hired them to teach Japanese people how to do the work. Every foreign expert came with a condition: train your replacement. The moment a Japanese engineer could do what you do, your contract ends. And they meant it. By the 1880s, the foreign experts were leaving, not because Japan fired them, because Japan no longer needed them. The first railway in Japan was built by British engineers in 1872, Tokyo to Yokohama, 29 kilometers. The Emperor Meiji rode it on opening day in a Western-style railway car, wearing a Western-style military uniform. The same man whose ancestors had never seen a steam engine was now inaugurating a national railway. In a single generation, Japan built over 7,000 kilometers of track. The toy Perry brought in 1853 had become a network that connected an entire nation. The transformation of Japan was not just industrial, it was personal. The men who ran the Meiji government made a decision that was deeply strange and deeply deliberate. They decided that Japan had to look modern before it was modern. Appearance first, reality would follow. The emperor set the example. He cut his hair. He stopped blackening his teeth in the traditional court style. He wore Western military uniforms to public ceremonies. He ate Western food at state dinners. He was photographed, something no previous Japanese emperor had ever allowed. His court followed. Noblemen who had worn silk robes for their entire lives appeared at official functions in frock coats and top hats, their wives in Victorian corsets and European evening gowns. The Rokumeikan, the Deer Cry Pavilion, opened in Tokyo in 1883, a Western-style ballroom built specifically for the Japanese elite to entertain foreign diplomats. Every Friday evening, Japanese aristocrats and government officials danced waltzes and polkas with European and American guests. Some of them had learned to dance specifically for this building. Some had never danced before in their lives. They did it anyway, because it was diplomacy, because it said to the Western world, "We are civilized, we are modern, you can deal with us as equals." But go home with the same man at the end of that evening, and everything changed. The frock coat came off, the kimono went on. Tea ceremony, tatami floors, lacquerware and silence. The Meiji elite lived simultaneously in two completely different civilizations. Monday morning, Western suit, Western breakfast, Western office with Western furniture. Monday evening, traditional robes, traditional food, traditional ritual. They didn't see this as contradiction. They saw it as strategy. Take what is useful from the West. Keep what is essential from Japan. Discard nothing that works. Adopt anything that strengthens. Their homes reflected this split perfectly. A Meiji nobleman's mansion typically had two halves. The Western wing, reception rooms with European furniture, oil paintings, chandeliers imported from France, for receiving foreign guests. The Japanese wing, tatami rooms, sliding screens, garden views, the same aesthetic their ancestors had known. For living, two worlds, one building, one life. By 1900, Japan had a modern army, a modern navy, 7,000 kilometers of railway, a constitution modeled on Germany's, universities teaching medicine, law, engineering, a postal system, a banking system, a telegraph network connecting every major city. In 50 years, Japan had done what Europe took 3 centuries to build. And then, Japan decided to prove it. 1904, Japan declared war on Russia. The Russian Empire, one of the great powers of the world, a nation that covered 11 time zones, an empire that European analysts assumed would crush Japan without significant difficulty. Japan destroyed the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, sank or captured 38 Russian ships, lost 3 torpedo boats. The world was stunned. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had defeated a European power in a major war. The toy train had become a battleship. But there was a price. There is always a price. The speed of transformation left fractures that never fully healed. The samurai class, the warriors who had defined Japan for 700 years, were abolished. Their stipends cut, their swords banned, their entire reason for existing erased by government decree. Some adapted. Some became businessmen, politicians, military officers. Many simply lost everything. The farmers who paid for all of it, the railways, the factories, the foreign experts, through taxes that took everything they had, saw almost nothing of the new wealth they had financed. And the speed itself was a cost. Japan absorbed Western technology, Western institutions, Western systems, but it absorbed them so fast that it never fully absorbed the ideas underneath them. The philosophy of individual rights, the slow argument of democracy, the tolerance of dissent. Japan took the train. It left the station. It never quite decided where it was going. The men who rode that toy locomotive on the beach in 1853, laughing, legs dragging on the ground, could not have imagined what their grandchildren would build, or what their grandchildren would destroy trying to prove it was enough.
That's what luxury actually looked like. Not what they put in the history books, what really happened behind closed doors. Drop a comment. Which civilization do you think lived the most extravagant life? I read every single one. Subscribe for the next story, and I'll see you there. Bye.